Yeah, so what I'm going to do in this video is replace the sub panel on my house. It has a 100 amp panel in it with only 12 spaces. And I'm going to replace it with that 125 amp panel that's got 30 spaces. And I've already replaced the main wire going into it here. Because originally it had 2-gauge aluminum wire that's only good for 100 amps. I replaced it with 1-aught aluminum that's good for 130 amps, I think, or 135. I'm sure a lot of you have a lot of 220 volt equipment and you don't have enough spaces in the panel, and that's why I'm doing this. And a lot of people put these type of breakers in their tandem breakers, where there's 2 breakers in each slot. I really don't like those. When I had one of them hooked up with a welder and I had it only turned up about 1/3 of the way, it would trip the breaker. And another one, that's a 20 amp one, when I put 13 amps of load on it, it pops the breaker. So they're really not the best way to go to use those type of breakers. And this panel, if you go to like Home Depot and Lowe's, the ones they have in stock have aluminum bus bars. But if you go on their websites, they sell ones with copper bus bars for like $10 more. And that's a way better way to go. If you're using like high amperage breakers with a lot of load on it, it will burn this up right here where the breakers go on it if you use the aluminum ones. Yeah, and this really isn't too hard to replace this. And this panel is going to go up way up here. I want to stay away from these air lines, and I'm going to have to trim the door out just a little bit to clear this. But the highest up breaker is only going to be right here, so it's not going to be any big deal. I can still reach it. Yeah, and also over here, when I first moved here, I put this sub panel in because I didn't have enough room to put one more breaker in there, so I could hook the air compressor up. I'm going to remove this and rewire the dryer the way it's supposed to go. And I'm also going to put in a plug socket for the air compressor and one for the lathe. And I'll probably put in one extra 20 amp plug socket in here. I do have a spot welder I could plug in sometimes. Yeah, so the first thing I'm going to do here is cut the sheetrock out. And I've already marked this out. And I'm going to do this before I turn the power off. I'll just be real careful. And I'm also going to take and cut about 1/4 of an inch off this bracket to give it more clearance. And originally it had a piece right in here that you could take out, because it would be very hard to get the panel in there if it's exactly the right size. But what I'm going to do after that is I'm going to cut a piece out down here instead. That way I can get the panel back in there as fast as possible and get the power turned back on, and then I can wire the plug sockets down here that I want to do. The lathe and the air compressor and one extra one. So I got the piece cut out up above it. And I just took and marked that, and I used that 3-inch air cutoff tool, and I cut into it just a little bit, and then I used a utility knife and cut the rest out. Yeah, so now I'm going to cut this other piece out down below here. It'll just be a piece about this wide all the way across. So I took and removed the wires from the bottom of the panel. It's very obvious where they go to, so I don't need to mark anything. So a lot of this stuff I'm going to mark, and other stuff I'm just going to turn the circuit breakers on and figure out what it does, because the panel's not labeled right now. And then I'm going to remove the panel. There's some nails and a couple of screws. And to hook that light up, I just took a power inverter up to my car for now. And I've got all the nails and everything removed. Some of these wires I'm going to mark, just so I know where they go, the bigger stuff. Yeah, I've already turned the power off and tested it to make sure it's really up before I start doing this. Yeah, I got the old panel out, and I'm just checking to make sure this fits. On the other garage, one of the 2x4s was in there crooked, and I had to cut the nails off, make a bracket, and move it over to make the panel fit in the wall. But this time it's going to fit. And before I can go any farther, I need to remove the wire for the dryer and run the new wire down here. Then I can get the panel in there and get the power turned back on. Then I'll hook the dryer back up. So I got all the knockouts done. You want to do that first, or you're going to be screwed if you try to do it later. So now I got to go up in the attic and run the 10-3 wire for the dryer. I just need to get it down there where I can put the panel back in the wall. Yeah, and that orange wire I just ran down here, that's for the dryer. So now I'm ready to put the panel in. And when you put the panel in, you want it flush with the wall. Yeah, so I got all the wires started through here. I ended up taking more of these knockouts out and putting more of these pieces in here, if you can even see that. Because originally this was real tight, it barely even fit through here. Yeah, so the panel's in the wall now. I just need to put the screws in, and it seems to fit perfect. Yeah, it was a kind of a tight fit in there. Yeah, so I got the panel mounted in there now. So the first thing you're going to do is hook the main wires up. And that's aluminum wire. Let me see if you can see this. But you got to put this stuff on the wires so it doesn't get corroded. Yeah, and the best thing to cut this big cable is these Klein cable cutters. Yeah, it's pretty hard to cut with that with wire cutters. So the main wires are all hooked up. So now I'm going to start hooking each one of these other wires up for the circuit breakers. Yeah, so I got the AC, stove, and dryer hooked up. The dryer breaker, I'll leave it off, and I'll finish hooking the rest of the stuff up so I can turn the power back on. Yeah, I just got the power turned back on. Yeah, I wish I could have filmed more of this, but I needed to hurry up and do it so I could get the power back on. So I still have the dryer to wire. And I'm going to put 3 plug sockets in below this panel. One for the air compressor, one for the lathe, and one extra one. I still have to wire this because I got to run new wire to this plug socket. It's not long enough. Yeah, I took and cut this out with a Dremel tool to clear that air bracket for the airlines. And look, there's only one space left. And that's where it clears this airline bracket. Yeah, I just got these plugs hooked up. And it just goes to that bottom breaker. And to fix this hole in the wall, you just screw 2 pieces of wood in here, and then you can screw the sheetrock across here. I got the dryer wire ran through the attic now. Tomorrow I'll pull this other wire out and put the right wire in here and remove that sub panel and that switch and that plug socket and patch those holes. And the easiest way on this to tell if it's 14 gauge wire or 12 gauge wire and this older wire that the housing's the same color on it is 14 gauge wire is 65 thousandths in diameter and 12 gauge is 80 thousandths. And on the 240 volt stuff, there should only be one plug socket per circuit breaker. On the 120 volt regular plugs, I think you can have up to 7 plug sockets per circuit breaker. The original electrical box was in the wall loose and 2 of the screws were stripped out, so I'm going to replace that. Yeah, this little DeWalt impact driver works great because I can get it up inside the wall to take these screws out. Yeah, and on these larger plug sockets, I always like to make my own bracket for the electrical box. And you got to make sure there's at least 5/8 of an inch sticking out here between this, or it won't make it through the wall. They do make ones that have brackets on it, but they're real flimsy, and every time you unplug it, the whole box moves around the wall. So it's much better like this. Yeah, I accidentally welded the box on facing the wrong direction first and had to redo this. Okay, so when you mount the box on the wall, you want to stick something across here that's flat and get the box to where it's just hitting up against it. I'm trying to hold this with my knee and everything else here. But that way you can get it in the right spot. Yeah, and the easiest way I've found to patch holes like this in the wall is just to screw a piece of plywood to the backside, then put a piece of sheetrock in there, and then mud over it, and you won't even know that it's there. Yeah, and here's what it looks like with 2 of the pieces of sheetrock in there. After I tape and mud over that, you'll never even see that. Yeah, and here's what it looks like after I've taped and mudded over it. It's best to let it dry and then like a day or 2 later go over it again. And this hole I still haven't done yet because there's something, I got to buy some parts for the dryer. It's blowing all the lint inside the wall. Yeah, and after the mud dries, you can even go over it a little bit with one of these sanding blocks. It's like, looks like a sponge almost. Yeah, so for the dryer, I was able to get one of those pieces that's much longer that goes through the wall, and I cut it down and made it work. Yeah, so I just put this 2x4 in here, so now it's going to be very easy to patch. If you always cut it out like this, then you just put a 2x4 on one side and you can patch this real easy. Yeah, here's what it looks like with that piece of sheetrock back in there. Now I just got to mud and tape over that. Yeah, so after this gets dry, what I'll do is sand it a little bit and then I'll go over it a little bit more. Yeah, I had to go over the whole thing. The sheetrock I use is 1/2 inch. Originally it's got 5/8 here, but I don't have any 5/8 and I didn't feel like going and buying any. But you can just go over the whole thing if it's just if you're not covering a great big spot. Yeah, and this is going to be where the plug socket for the lathe is going to go. And to pull the wire through, what you can do is just put a welding rod through the hole and tape it to it and pull it through. Yeah, and I got the plug socket for the lathe wired, and it all works. So now I'm going to cut this piece out. Now 2 plug sockets are going to go in here. I don't know if you can see where I marked that. Yeah, and this plug socket here is the extra plug. The air compressor one's a little more complicated because I'm going to put a 30 amp double pole light switch on it so I can turn the air compressor on and off. Yeah, so I got both of the plug sockets in and it's wired to the panel, to the breaker. So now I just need to put the switch in here, and the breaker's still turned off. Yeah, I got the light switch mounted in there. This one there's very little room here. What I did was put a piece of 1/2 inch plywood underneath it and it spaced it out exactly the right amount. So now I just got to fix these holes in the wall. Yeah, and for this switch I would only need a 20 amp double pole switch, but I went with a 30 because it's more heavy duty. Yeah, so now I just got to mud and tape over all this stuff. And when you do this, you want to make sure you don't screw into the wires. That's why I marked the wall here where the wires are at in these places, so I don't accidentally screw into the wire. Yeah, so I just put a bunch of mud on there, and this still is a little low. And tomorrow what I'll do, or after this dries, I'll put the tape on it and mud it again. Yeah, so this back wall behind the dryer is finished now. I just got to let this dry, then I can put the cover on that. And the plug socket behind the lathe is finished. As soon as that dries, I'll put the cover on. These 3 spots I got to go over again. Yeah, it just takes time to do that. Yeah, so I got that done, and I got the dryer back where it goes. Yeah, I put these 2 heaters in there. They seem to be drying this stuff out much faster. Yeah, the 220 volt stuff takes up a lot of spaces in the panel, because each breaker takes 2 spaces and you only put 1 plug socket on each circuit breaker. Yeah, I'm just about finished. I just got to sand that mud a little bit after it dries, then put the covers back on everything, and then it's done. And this whole project only cost me, I'd probably have about $400 in doing this. Yeah, if you hire an electrician, it would be thousands of dollars. Yeah, and this is pretty easy to do this. It just takes time to patch all the holes in the wall. That takes the most amount of time. Putting the panel in went pretty fast. I think it took about 6 or 7 hours to get the panel in there and everything hooked back up. And if your house has any aluminum wire in it, you want to replace that. This house originally had it go into the dryer, the AC, and the stove, which I replaced it. And on the stove, they hooked copper wire onto the aluminum wire and ran the plug down farther, that's really bad. Yeah, what the plan is to replace the main panel with a 200 amp panel, and I'll put a 125 amp breaker into the house and a 125 amp breaker into the garage that's in my backyard. The reason I haven't done that yet is the electrical's underground, and you got a whole bunch of concrete has to come out and be replaced because you have to put bigger conduit in to do that. There's also some transformer boxes that are in the driveway. Those have to be replaced with full traffic boxes. The power company out here has to do that, and they charge a lot of money to do that. And the sidewalk also has to be redone to where it's a driveway. So that's why the main panel is going to be one of the last projects I do. And here's what it looks like all finished. I know there's a bunch of dust blowing around in here because I just ran the blower. Yeah, now I just got to figure out where I want to mount this thing because it's going to have to go in a different place where I keep paper and pins. Yeah, so that worked out perfect to mount that right there. Because it has to have the right distance between the 2x4s to be able to screw that in, and this came out perfect here.